Hey everybody, Hiraj here, and welcome back to the Doctor in Yellow channel. Great to see all of you as always. And today I wanted to talk about something that I feel is interesting in examining some of my own habits and approaches to tarot reading, as well as that of many of the community. I think that there is a lot to be said about situations where an animal themed deck might be appropriate for some readers versus a deck that has exclusively human depictions. And what I mean by animal themed is there are animals represented foremost and primarily in the deck as opposed to human depictions, or humans are secondary to animals in the deck in terms of the illustrations, or there might just be humans on a couple of cards, but the rest of the cards are all animal themed. And there are a few reasons that I feel some individuals might prefer an animal themed deck instead of traditional human depictions. And I'm going to get into those reasons, and there are 6 of them that I've outlined that I think are good to consider to find out if you might prefer an animal themed deck just as your primary deck or depending on your needs for what you're looking to accomplish in a particular reading. So I am focusing specifically on animal themed versus a traditional human depiction as opposed to one that doesn't depict either. So there are some decks that have neither animal nor human depictions. The Spacious Tarot comes to mind with that. The Yellow House Tarot is another example of that. And there are a few other decks. Mindscapes is a third example, where you kind of have like a first person perspective or like a landscape that doesn't depict anything in terms of humans or animals. And that is kind of its own category that we can discuss another time because I think those particular decks have a myriad of other very, very cool uses. But for this purpose and purposes of this video, I'm looking at, again, traditional versus animal decks. And to talk about this, I specifically have 2 decks that I'm going to be using. I have the Radiant Rider-Waite Tarot, and this is just what I'm going to be using to show more of the traditional Rider-Waite-Smith imagery, just for comparison purposes primarily. And the animal theme deck that I'm going to be using in this video is the Heartwood Tarot by Three Trees Tarot, based in the UK. Amazing company. They have a lot of great decks. The Heartwood Tarot is the only deck of theirs that I have, and this is how the deck looks. These are the backs of the cards, which are so cute. You can see the little mouse there. And this particular deck depicts the fool's journey from the perspective of a mouse that finds an abandoned cottage in the forest and then encounters adventures and other creatures there. So it's a really cool deck, a really cool theme. And again, shout out to Three Trees Tarot because their decks are high quality consistently. So this is what I want to look at as the animal theme deck for this video. I do also want to make a quick distinction between the deck that I'm going to be using and some animal theme decks because some animal decks can kind of anthropomorphize the animals so that they're essentially humans but just with animal features or faces. And I think in those cases, that leans a little bit more toward the human depictions for, again, purposes of this video. So I'm looking at non-anthropomorphized animals as opposed to human depictions specifically. So just wanted to be clear about that. Now, like I mentioned earlier, there are 6 primary reasons why I feel someone might feel more comfortable with an animal-themed deck as opposed to a traditional deck. And there are many more reasons than this, but these are ones that I feel might be more commonly found among the tarot community because one thing that I think is the case very often when it comes to readers who use animal decks is that they're looking at the artwork and are able to connect with the artwork more and prefer that deck for that reason. But what I'm going to be talking about is a little bit different. It's not artwork based primarily. It's more about representations, depictions, that aren't necessarily about the art style. So it gets into a little bit more of what the mind might prefer when completing a reading. So that's what we're going to get into. Now, the first reason that I feel someone might feel more comfortable with an animal themed deck is if there is what I call an identity disparity when it comes to connecting with the themes for certain cards. And what I mean by that is when we're looking at the cards in the tarot, oftentimes they're depicting an archetype irrespective of the apparent identity of the human figure in the card. So even if there is a feminine figure or masculine figure, there may not be a direct association between feminine and masculine identity representation in those cards. It's simply a depiction of an archetype. However, there are some readers who might be a little bit put off by that. So they may not be able to see themselves identity-wise in a particular archetypal depiction. So let me show you a couple of examples of that. So in the traditional Rider-Waite-Smith tradition, I'm going to use the High Priestess and the Emperor as examples of this. So you can see that this more traditional depiction of the High Priestess depicts a woman. And for the Emperor, we see a depiction of a man. Now, does that mean that a reader needs to be a man to exhibit the qualities of an emperor? No. Do they need to be a woman to exhibit the qualities of the High Priestess or connect with the High Priestess? Also no. So these are representations of archetypes. However, because of the physical human depictions on the cards, it might be difficult for some readers to fully connect with the archetypes and understand the messages underlying each. And that's what I'm referring to when I use the term identity disparity. If you are a man, for example, it could be possible that you see the High Priestess and have a difficult time connecting with the messages the High Priestess presents because there is a depiction of a woman. Or you could be a woman and have a hard time connecting with the archetype of the Emperor for the same reason. Or you can be anywhere on the gender spectrum and struggle with that with either of these cards or similar cards as well. So a woman can be an emperor, a man can be a high priestess, but when you have that identity disparity, it can just make it difficult to fully connect with the messages. When you have an animal-themed deck, however, that sort of identity disparity becomes much less pronounced if it's not eliminated entirely. So I want to take a look at the High Priestess in the Heartwood Tarot. So again, here is the traditional Rider-Waite-Smith depiction of the card. And then here is the High Priestess in the Heartwood Tarot. So you see there's a depiction of a bird. The bird has a crown on top of some pomegranates. Obviously, we see the parallels between the bird and the High Priestess here. But when you look at the animal image on the right, for someone who might have that issue with identity disparity, it might be easier to connect with this card because gender isn't as pronounced in its representation as it is with the High Priestess. Same thing with the Emperor. So again, this is the traditional Rider-Waite depiction of the Emperor. And then this is the depiction of the Emperor in the Heartwood Tarot. So we have a wolf descending a staircase and approaching our little mouse main character there. So again, with this card, gender is not as pronounced and as present as you see in this depiction. So I think, in my opinion, it's just human nature that many of us may look at an illustration and interpret the depiction therein as kind of being a little bit more pronounced and sometimes overshadowing the underlying message. And it can be easy to get caught up in the illustration if there is a difference between how we see ourselves and how we identify versus what we're seeing in the card. So for many readers, it might be easier to use an animal themed deck with these kinds of depictions because there's not the extra task of having to separate yourself from what you're seeing in the image, and you can project yourself and your identity more easily onto that which may initially appear to be gender neutral. So that's a reason why I feel there might be many folks who appreciate an animal deck as opposed to a more traditional human depiction of the cards. Now, the second thing that I want to take a look at, now this one is one that I find interesting as well. And the second reason is if you are the type of reader, and I put myself in this category to be clear, if you're the type of reader who has a tendency to think in extremes, when you see a card, to the extent that you might sometimes neglect the nuance in that card, oftentimes an animal deck might help with understanding some of the nuances behind what you're seeing. So let me give you, I have a few examples of this. So let me give you a few. Now, say you are presenting an inquiry about a person and you want to find out what type of person someone is, right? And you pull a card and you get the devil, right? You see this in response to your query about the type of person that someone is. Now, if you're the type of reader who might have an initial inclination to think in terms of extremes, you're like, oh, this person's terrible. I don't want anything to do with them. I don't want them around me. I don't want anything to do with that. Get that away from me. I don't want that person in my life. And then when you immediately go to that, sometimes you might neglect the nuance that's present in the card and the meaning associated with the devil because the initial image that you're seeing, the human-based image, is so striking. Now let's look at the devil in the Heartwood tarot. So here's the depiction of the devil. You see our little mouse main character, and little mouse is wrapped up in some thorns, which again, as we can see in considering the meaning of the devil, often has to do with entrapment that we may not notice or need to be aware of in order to progress toward our goals unencumbered. So it can be easy to succumb to certain proclivities, certain temptations, certain habits or behaviors that are ill-suited for our goals and get caught up in them, much in the same way that you would get caught up in some thorns, right? So really, really cool depiction of the devil. But if you ask that same query, you present that same query and you get this card, your mind might not have the same visceral reaction. You might be able to look at the illustration and appreciate a little bit more of the nuance. So again, if we're asking what type of person is this, instead of it being kind of a knee-jerk reaction to push that person away and be like, no, that person is terrible, they're all bad, we see a little bit more nuance and might be able to say, maybe this is someone who's struggling a little bit. Maybe this is someone who has some personal demons that they're currently succumbing to and are having a hard time with that. And they might not be in the best place right now. So it's a little bit more of a nuance with the devil that might be lost versus if we're looking at this card, which can be so visceral and pronounced in a firm kind of planting of the flag in a particular message, which for, again, a reader who might have a tendency to think in extremes, it can be easy to look at that and disregard any nuance. I do want to take another quick moment to shout out Three Trees Tarot, because in this deck, the Heartwood Tarot, there are some alternatives for different cards. So the Devil is an example of this, and here is an alternate Devil that's presented in this deck. Both are so beautiful. And they have alternates for, I believe, the Ace of Cups and also the Lovers cards. So I just love Three Trees Tarot for providing choices. I really tend to gravitate toward decks that allow for a measure of customizability. Like if you can choose between different cards, I always appreciate that. So just wanted to give that quick shout out. Another example of kind of the black and white thinking or extreme thinking can be in seeing a card like the Five of Pentacles, which is our traditional Rider-Waite-Smith depiction of the card. Looks terrible, looks that, we're about to encounter some difficulties or already going through some difficulties. There's not really a lot of relief in sight. It can be a very stark black and white interpretation of the card, and some nuance might be missing. Versus if we look at the Five of Pentacles in the Heartwood Tarot, we see that, yeah, there's some challenge going on there. But when you see that fox at the base of the tree, there's sort of a sense of peace and comfort despite everything that's going on outside. So a little bit of nuance to the card. So where in the Five of Pentacles with the traditional depiction, that nuance might be missing, in the Five of Pentacles in this deck, which I think is the case for a lot of animal decks, we see a little bit more nuance. So despite the struggles that we're experiencing or the struggles that might come up in the near future, how can we maintain a sense of peace and comfort despite what's going on? I also think that kind of a black and white way of thinking can be challenging to overcome with the traditional depiction in a deck, specifically if we're performing some self-reflection. So say you are self-reflecting or doing shadow work, or you're just doing a reading on yourself to understand more about your habits and behaviors or decisions you've made in the past or something similar. And as a representation of yourself, you get the Seven of Swords. And so in this card, obviously we're very familiar with the traditional depiction of the Seven of Swords. This is the type of card where if you pulled it up in reference to yourself, it doesn't really feel the best to look at this, right? You look at this and you're like, maybe I could have done some things differently in the past. Maybe I can be moving differently now. What am I doing that may not be the best reflection of my character because this is me, right? Versus if you see a depiction like this in the Heartwood Tarot, this is the Seven of Swords there, and we see that we have the mouse, which again is representing the Fool on the Fool's journey, and there's a separation between the Fool on the Fool's journey and the concept behind the Seven of Swords at large. So instead of this being you, this then becomes something you have done, something around you, or a part of your experience rather than you yourself. And I feel like a lot of animal decks do a great job of kind of portraying the difference between those things, those concepts. And I feel like when you're engaged in a self-reflective practice, an animal deck can help a lot in terms of feelings of shame or guilt or self-criticality, so that you can move forward with growth and change more productively. But I think the same concept is applicable also to quote unquote good cards, right? So let me show you a different example here with the Ten of Cups. So again, when we're taking that concept of black and white thinking, we might look at the Ten of Cups and be like, oh man, that's amazing. If we go back to that original query and we say, tell me what type of person this is, and we get the Ten of Cups, that might immediately signal, oh, this person's great. This is someone I want to get to know. This is someone I want in my life. And we lose the nuance there, right? Just the same way that we might lose the nuance with other cards. Then we have the depiction of the Ten of Cups in the Heartwood Tarot. And we have the same underlying concepts, right? We have the rainbow. We have the depiction of family. There's a sense of happiness there, right? But when you look a little bit more closely, you see some broken bottles. You see some chips on the tub. You see some things that need to be fixed up, some weeds. Even though things are good, there's still progress to be made. There's still growth that needs to happen, right? So it offers a little bit more nuance versus looking at the traditional imagery. So this might be another reason why an animal deck might be a little bit more suitable if, again, you are the type of reader who might more readily gravitate toward the polar opposites or polar extremes of a particular card meaning rather than considering the details. Now, another reason that might seem pretty apparent for why people might prefer an animal themed deck is if they want to connect with a sense of nature a bit more easily. So I'm going to use a couple of examples here. This is the Six of Cups. We're familiar with the imagery of the Six of Cups. Heartwarming energy, very soft, allows us to reflect, often wistfully, on things that have happened in the past, and there's a gentleness about this card. However, it doesn't necessarily have a ton of strong depictions of the natural world. There's some greenery, some flowers here, but not like you would find with a lot of animal decks. This is the Six of Cups in the Heartwood Tarot. So when you look at this card, you see nature all up and throughout this card. The animals, of course, which are the frogs in this case, but also the mushroom growth within this cabin and the moss. There's a ladybug here as well. There's such a strong sense of kind of nature taking back what belongs to it in the first place. And this is something that you may not necessarily get in decks that feature more traditional imagery, where you're seeing people. A lot of times you're seeing kind of modernity, you're seeing buildings, you're seeing streets and roads. You're not necessarily seeing the natural world, which can sometimes be something a reader wants, especially if they find themselves in an area where they don't have immediate access to a natural environment like a forest or a park even. And so being able to see those things in the cards can be very helpful. Another example would be with the Three of Cups. This is the traditional depiction, and then compare that to Three of Cups in Heartwood. So we have the same underlying theme and idea, but a much stronger representation of the natural world through the birds themselves and the greenery around, which is just stunning in this card, in my opinion. So you just get more of a sense of the natural world. And if you're the type of reader who really connects with nature in their spiritual practice, or you might practice witchcraft as a green witch, or you might do any of a number of things that require you to really stay connected with a sense of nature and the peace that it offers, a lot of times animal decks will suit that purpose and do a great job of it. So another point to keep in mind. Now, a fourth reason why someone might prefer an animal themed deck is a lot of times with decks that are more traditional in that they are human centered, there can be some pretty brutal depictions. There can be some violent depictions. There can be some depictions that are sometimes a little bit gory even, that can be uncomfortable to look at. And that same thing is not nearly as present, in my opinion, in a lot of animal themed decks. So obviously we're all familiar with the Ten of Swords, right? The Ten of Swords is difficult to look at. To be quite honest, you see this card and there's a brutality about it, right? You have someone who's bleeding and stabbed in the back. And even though we have kind of this dawn approaching, it's a brutal image. It's very visceral. You see it, you have an immediate reaction to it, and it can be a little bit tough to look at. And sometimes when we're completing a reading, just kind of as a daily reading or a meditative practice, brutality as it is depicted in certain more traditional cards might just be a little bit more than we need in any given moment. And so something that is a little bit gentler but communicates the same thing might be preferable. So here is how the Ten of Swords looks in the Heartwood. So obviously we can still see the 10 swords here, But instead of, stabbing a person in the back, obviously, we have it on a stack of books indicating different concepts like grief, sorrow, and despair on the spines of the books. We have the butterflies emerging from the pages, and it communicates that same concept, but is much easier to digest visually and emotionally compared to some of the more brutal imagery associated with traditional decks. Another example of this is, in my opinion, the death card. With this traditional depiction, we see death, trampling someone. It can be a little bit hard to look at. I mean, it's a very strong statement. It's a strong message. And strong messages are good. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But sometimes those messages might be more palatable through a different lens, where we're retaining the same meaning and the same concept, but without some of the imagery that's a little bit more difficult to look at. So here's the death card in Heartwood. So we see that obviously death is still depicted. We have the mouse main character alongside a bird that has passed with a flower growing out of it. There is a sorrow about this card still, but might be a little bit easier for someone to digest. That kind of removes a little bit of the violence from the concept of the death card in this case. So again, some subtle distinctions here, but when it comes to the type of work you're looking to do with the tarot or what you're looking to achieve during a specific session or reading, you might not need to be beaten over the head with a message. You might just need that same message, but presented in a more gentle manner. So let's take a look at our fifth reason here. And this is one that might speak to quite a few people. But when we're talking about traditional imagery in the tarot, there's obviously a lot of very overt religious imagery. Specifically in the traditional Rider-Waite-Smith system, you're going to see that throughout the deck. There's several major, several minor arcana that have traditional religious imagery in it. It typically leans toward Christian imagery. And for those, even if they identify as Christian, or if they don't, they may not necessarily feel comfortable seeing an explicitly religious theme presented in a card, and that is often absent when you're dealing with an animal theme deck. So here we have obviously the Hierophant. We are familiar with the Hierophant, and a very clear Pope-like depiction here, and is called the Pope in many different decks. Obviously a very explicitly religious image, and for someone who may kind of bristle at religious imagery, or they have experiences with religion that may not be the best, or they're just not looking for that in their deck, they may want to replace that with a different depiction as found in an animal-themed deck. So in the Heartwood Tarot, we have the Hierophant here, which I think is really a clever depiction because we have the overtly religious imagery removed. You might be able to make an argument that the design of the window and the shape of it is kind of reminiscent of what you might find in a church or with a stained glass window, but it doesn't hit you over the head with that religious imagery, and you might be able to connect with the archetype and the meanings behind it a little bit more easily if you are able to kind of digest an image without that religious depiction explicitly placed in it. Another example of that is the Judgment card. We have the resurrection depicted here, and we have an angelic figure that's facilitating that. And so again, for someone who may not connect too much with religious imagery, they may want to see something else instead. So the Judgment card in the Heartwood looks like this. We have the mouse looking at themselves in the mirror and reflecting on what they're seeing and what they're understanding. And obviously you see no religious imagery here. So that's something to take into consideration regarding whether you want primarily animals depicted in a deck, because you lose some of the more cultural elements among which religion is included, that are associated with humans and are dealing more with kind of a natural environment that can feel more neutral and therefore more palatable for a lot of people. Now, this last reason, I don't even necessarily have any specific card that demonstrates it, but it is the concept of just not wanting to see people. So I'm imagining a situation, and I'm just going to go through some of the cards in the Heartwood. I'm imagining a situation where someone had a rough day at work and their boss was being terrible to them, and they were dealing with their coworkers and, dealing with their families, issues with parents, issues with siblings. They're driving home, they're on the road, people are cutting them off. They go to the grocery store, they're talking to the person checking them out, and the person's rude to them. And you might have a day like that where people are just giving you a headache. People are just being a lot, and you just don't want to see any more people. You just want to pull out a deck at the end of the day and just not see anybody. You just don't want to be bothered with anybody. And an animal deck can certainly help with that. Where it's just you, it's the animals, it's a forest or a cottage in the case of this deck. There's nobody cutting you off on the road. There's no one sending you any texts giving you grief. There's no boss yelling at you. There's nobody wagging their finger at you about what you're doing or not doing. It's just peaceful, right? When we talk about peace, how about this card, right? What a peaceful card. Put down those wands and just curl up next to a fireplace. And that's what we need sometimes. Sometimes when you're in a certain state of mind or looking to accomplish a certain goal with the tarot, sometimes seeing people is just not going to be something that's going to keep you in the right frame of mind. Isn't this such a pretty Page of Swords? Such a beautiful owl. And looking at animals can certainly help with that. I realize that I have, randomly, I have 3 back-to-back owl cards here. Justice is an owl also, appropriately. That's something to keep in mind too. If you notice your blood pressure rising sometimes because of your interactions with other people, and you know that that's going to be a hindrance if you're seeing more people in your tarot deck when you're trying to get some peace, that might be a reason to use animal depictions instead. So just something to keep in mind. I just can't get over how gorgeous the Heartwood Tarot is. I'll just show a few more here. And then I will let you go. So that's what I wanted to speak with you about today. Just some things to keep in mind and to consider when you're looking for a primary deck or a deck for a specific purpose. If you have a goal in mind for a specific session or season in your life with the tarot, keep that in mind. See if any of these reasons resonate with you about what you prefer to see in your deck. And I think when we pay more attention to these things and we're more aware of how our minds work and how they interact with the tarot, we can enhance our tarot practice. So let me know what you think of this video. Let me know what type of deck you prefer. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, or if you found some additional reasons beyond the ones that I included here. I'm always open to hearing your perspective, because in this community, We are about building a collective body of knowledge. So thank you again for spending some time with me. I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll talk soon.